everyone, and welcome to the Human Rights Lawyers Association event this evening on school exclusions. My name is Avril Rushe. I'm a member of the Human Rights Lawyers Association Executive Committee, and also I'm a member of the chambers here, number 5 chambers, who are kindly hosting our event this evening. Now, we're here in person in London, but we do have others joining us online at home. So a very warm welcome to our attendees who are at home. We have a distinguished panel this evening who are joining me. We have one person who will make their presentation online. So let's hope the technology gods start to look favourably on us. And we also have 2 panellists here in person in London. The panellists will each share their own take on this very broad-ranging and important topic. And I certainly look forward to hearing their insights into a topic that has such far-reaching implications for students, schools, families, and of course communities. Now, the event we hope to run until 7:30, and we'll have some time for questions and answers. For those on Zoom, if you could please write your questions in the chat function. And then for those here, we can do it in the old-fashioned way, or you can write it down and pass it up if you would prefer that. So our first speaker today is Professor Harry Daniels. He's going to be giving his presentation over Zoom online. Professor Daniels is a professor of education at Oxford University. He has directed more than 40 research projects funded by various ESC or CR grants, EU grants, national and local government sources, and he has extensive publications in a series of internationally acclaimed books in social and cultural psychology. At present, he is the principal investigator in the Excluded Lives project. This is a multidisciplinary project aiming to advance the understanding of the political economies of school exclusions and to understand how more equitable outcomes could be achieved for pupils, their families, and for professionals. I hope you'll all join me in welcoming Professor Daniels. Thank you very much, Harry.
Thanks very much indeed, Avril. I should say at the outset, I'm co-principal investigator on this project with Ian Thompson, and there's a large group of us, which I'll explain in a moment. I want to start off by making the point that most of the figures that one reads about exclusion grossly underestimate the size of the problem. If you look at the DFE's statistical first release, you'll get a glimpse on the official figures. But my first slide, please. It's not working. Can I have the next slide, please? That's it. This is the Local Government Association, who did an exercise where they try to estimate the numbers of young people missing out on education, and you'll have these to take away with you on a printed copy, so I won't do the detail now, but their minimum estimate of the number of young people missing out was about 208,000. The maximum was over 1 million, which is just pretty jaw-dropping on its own. But we think possibly that's an underestimate as well, given the number of young people who in the times of the lockdowns didn't engage with schooling in any shape, way or form, didn't actually have much to do with their homes, and were out in the community just, well, larking around quite a lot of the time. And many people that we've spoken to think these young people will not re-engage with schooling at all. So we're dealing with a pretty substantial issue here if one understands exclusion in terms of not being able to engage with meaningful education. And the next slide, please. This was taken from, I think, a bit of political action on the London Underground, which talks about the school to prison pipeline, which has been much discussed. But what we're trying to do is to understand through a home international comparison the contextual and institutional processes that lead to different types of school exclusion, both official and hidden. Hidden's a polite way of often saying illegal, and the consequences for excluded young people, their families, and others. And the next slide, please. This team that's working on this was brought together over a very long period of time. And part of our argument was that we tend only to view the phenomena of exclusion through a single disciplinary lens. So this is a multi-disciplinary team. There are lawyers, criminologists, psychiatrists, educationalists of all different sorts, economists, who are trying to bring together a very broad picture of the the processes and the consequences of exclusion. And this is being done across the 4 jurisdictions of the UK. So we have a team in Oxford, a team in Cardiff, a team in Belfast, and a team in Edinburgh. And colleagues at LSE are working on the costs of exclusion, the financial costs of exclusion, which no one really knows what they are at the moment. We're engaging with all sorts of different stakeholders. We're having high levels of public engagement. And based on the work of Laura Lundy, who is a human rights lawyer in Belfast, we've set up groups of, young people's research advisory groups, where we're not researching them, they are advising us. And they are young people who have had experience of exclusion themselves. And they are looking at the instruments we develop, the results that we find, and they're giving us a critical commentary from their point of view about what's going on. We've also got an international network. If I could go to the next slide, please. Of course, we just about got going in our data collection, and then COVID happened. And can we go back, please? Thank you. And there are we undertook a series of conversations with people at very different positions in the system with regard to exclusion. So on the one hand, people in the NHS who are responsible for safeguarding, and on the other hand, teachers and community workers, head teachers, people in local authorities, people in the third sector, about what they thought were going to be the new risks of exclusion arising from COVID. There are 3 publications which are available on our website, with the details of which are at the bottom end of this presentation. But I'm not going to deal particularly with those now, but you may find them useful. Next one, please. Next slide, please. Right. Looking at the policy issues themselves is illuminating. And the next slide, please. If you look at the English guidance, full of the words punishment and poor behavior, teachers' powers to punish poor behavior, to use reasonable force, to use detention, to search pupils, to confiscate, to use seclusion or isolation rooms, and in extremist to exclude pupils. That's from the Discipline and Behavior and Discipline in Schools 2016 guidance. And the next slide, please. Now, when you look at the English figures, until fairly recently, when they became highly disrupted by COVID events, about 8,000 young people were officially permanently excluded from English schools. In Scotland, which I know is smaller, but is not without its areas of challenge, the number was 3, not 3,000, but 3 individuals. So 8,000 against 3. And if you look at the policy documents, rather than all this talk of discipline, behavior, the Scottish documents have included, engaged and involve, a positive approach to preventing and managing school exclusions, restorative justice being right at the top of their agenda. So a completely different cultural position on exclusion. And the next slide, please. Now, the informal practices give even maybe more concern about this issue. Next slide, please. I'm beginning to feel like somebody on one of those early day COVID number 10 Downing Street things. Or the next slide. Our colleagues in Wales are very concerned about the extent to which young people, not just excluded as in removed from the building, but removed from classrooms, placed on corridors, being asked to sit outside staff offices, placed in isolation units, which they think have the same sort of long-term effects as exclusion itself, and are often running at a very, very high level. We don't know the extent of that. And the next slide, please. Right, the mechanisms of exclusion, and the next slide, please. We know there's massive geographical variation. I've referred to that between Scotland and England, but across the UK, there are certain areas that historically have witnessed very high levels of exclusion. We also know that there's disproportionate overrepresentation of certain groups. This has been well established for decades that, for instance, Black Afro-Caribbean youngsters are much more likely to get excluded. Youngsters with special needs are much more likely to get excluded. Boys are much more likely to be excluded. Young people in public care are much more likely to be excluded. Now, we haven't got all that far in actually pinning down what the mechanisms of that disproportionate exclusion are. The next slide, please. And one of the ways we're thinking about this is that when you go to some of the schools that are disproportionately excluding young people, it's almost as if this practice was invisible. It's taken as everyday or common sense. It's the way we do things. And some American sociologists argue that infrastructure is invisible when it operates smoothly and only becomes visible when it breaks down. And some of the assumptions that underpin the practices that exist in schools and local authorities only become visible when they break down, and they're not very often open to public scrutiny. Some of the things that we're hearing about at the moment by way of in one school, exclusion for swearing is commonplace and not commonplace in another school. In one school, being disciplined for having a shirt not tucked in, and so on and so forth. All these things show huge variability. And it's about the categories that exist of being acceptable, being not acceptable, how these are differentially applied to different groups, how these are established in the first place, which is of interest to us. And the next slide, please. That these categories may be seen as a form of the argument of the institution, irrespective of the validity of the claims. There are all sorts of claims made around the place, particularly about something, for instance, like zero tolerance, which in North America now, where it largely has its origins, is pretty widely accepted as a dysfunctional tactic. These categories are used as a resource for dealing with problems within the socio-cultural processes of schooling. And those categories and categorization carry consequences for the use of resources and of course, worryingly, for the processes of identity formation for young people. And the next slide, please. Right, exclusion in mental health. We have good content. contacts with a number of psychiatrists and a psychiatrist who is a member of our team. And that's Mina Fazell, who's in the psychiatry department of Oxford and in practice as a psychiatrist as well. Can we, next slide, please? Now, a fairly recent Young Minds survey suggests that over half of young people believe they'll be a failure if they don't get good grades. Over half of 11 to 14-year-olds have viewed online pornography, and 4 out of 10 of these are saying it's affected their relationships with others of their age. Half of children and young people have been bullied. 4 out of 10 11 to 14-year-olds skip meals to stay thin. And 1/3 of children and young people don't know where to turn to get help when they feel depressed or anxious. Next slide, please. Now, this comes from the Spirit Level, a fairly well-known study of the consequences for well-being of different forms of societal organization. This chart shows on the bottom income inequality, and on the left-hand side, it's the UNESCO measure of child well-being. And you can see, for instance, Sweden and Finland have pretty low levels of income inequality and very high levels of well-being. And rather sadly, down in almost the right-hand corner, the UK with very high levels of inequality, income inequality, and very, very low levels of child well-being. The child well-being data for young people in the UK are really worryingly poor. Next slide, please. Now, we also know that mental health problems in children intensify over time. Being excluded from school worsens educational and other prospects for the child. And Tamsin Ford at Cambridge has now established pretty conclusively that mental health difficulties are a precursor and an outcome of exclusion. In other words, if we look at the numbers of youngsters excluded, high proportion of those had mental health difficulties before they were excluded, and even more developed mental health difficulties after they've been excluded. These mental health problems in children persist into and recur in adulthood. Anxiety disorders affect 10% of children by the age of 16. They significantly impair everyday function, persist into adulthood, and increase the risk of other psychiatric disorders. And low education and literacy levels are associated with poverty and social exclusion, which are in turn associated with mental health. These things are inextricably bound together. Next slide, please. And this is Mina's latest statement on the thing, because she's saying, we tend to look at individuals. What should we do with this individual who has a mental health difficulty? And she's arguing the discourse needs to move away from thinking about individuals to broader systems level approaches to address pupil, family, school, and community differences, difficulties, and overall challenges of inclusion and acceptance. That there's something structural about the way that UK society operates that leads to some of these problems. And at the moment, it looks as though the Scottish situation is less toxic in that sense than the one that obtains in England. Next slide, please. From our work, there's a few things. I'll go through these quite quickly because they are all on, and I'm rather aware I'm going to go over time. What needs to be done? We need to foster a nuanced understanding of vulnerability. Recognize the diversity of children and young people, including those with pre-existing vulnerabilities that's been overlaid with COVID, and those who become vulnerable due to COVID, and embrace the risk factors and children and young people's views on their needs, moving from a focus on vulnerable children and young people to focusing on vulnerable context. That means engaging with children and young people using a rights-based approach. The number of people we've spoken to who do not know what has happened to them in the process of exclusion, do not know whether they've been permanently excluded or not, do not know whether or not they're being treated reasonably in the way that some schools have operated. We need to learn from the positive benefits for some children of COVID-19, and there were many children who had different educational circumstances really enjoyed those differences. But above all, we need to produce granular live data at local and national levels to monitor the movement of policy into practice, including attendance, which is a crucial issue at the moment, across all types of settings and absences. Another lawyer in our team looked at the way in which a policy has moved into practice by asking people about the law on exclusion, sorry. And when she asked pretty much anybody in the education service what the law on exclusion was, they almost all of them said it's a set of rules you've got to follow. Whereas when she asked solicitors and barristers, they said, well, it's an interesting body of law because it can be used with discretion, and used with discretion to achieve the best possible outcome for all those concerned. That same thing, the law on exclusion, had been recontextualized in very different ways. Next slide, please. We need to recognize and promote well-being as fundamental for all children and young people. And that's partly taking a contextual approach to safeguarding and well-being, building on existing provision, including mental health support, school nursing, designated safeguarding leads, and so on. Supporting all schools to review their culture and values within pedagogy and curriculum, particularly around, the tragedy of the recent cutting of the arts provision in school, and in some schools not taking on board the messages that come out of the Black Lives Matter movement. To develop guidance on whole school approaches to well-being, including social and emotional aspects of learning, understanding trauma, a focus on relationship building at all levels. What's very interesting, when we've come across schools which do this sort of thing, young people take it on board. So when we talk about exclusion with them, they understand these processes in these terms, rather than the sort of very severe, one might say brutalizing forms of punishment that exist in some schools. We of course need to strengthen training as well to go alongside all this. And the next slide, please. And we need to identify and resolve policy and practice contradictions. When we look across the services that are engaged with children and young people, it becomes very clear very quickly they are operating with different incentives, with different priorities, with different values. And when these come into practice, the consequences for young people are often fairly disastrous. I would, of course, ask, well, where are the incentives for schools for working with young people who at times, and I say only at times, may be quite challenging? Next slide, please. And in part, this is an argument for getting the balance right. We've had years and years and years of attainment talk in education. And of course, attendance and attainment are important, but there needs to be an appropriate balance with well-being and safeguarding. We use the term getting the balance right because we spoke with the chief executive of a very large multi-academy trust. And when we said we need to do more on well-being and safeguarding, we got harangued for being soggy liberals who all we wanted to do was sit down and have a cup of tea with very difficult children. And he completely dismissed any suggestion that more emphasis on safeguarding and well-being should be increased. So we're arguing for getting the balance right. And the next slide, please. And this comes from Tim Brighouse, who has done a lot of work in London, but was the the chief education officer in Birmingham when I was there. We need to start building fences along the top of the cliff rather than parking the ambulances at the bottom. And if only we could get into more upstream working, more contextual safeguarding, then the position of many young people's lives would be a lot better. Thank you. And the next slide, please. And that's the website where there's a lot of information and much more detail about what I've said so far. I think I've just about squeezed that in to the 15 minutes. So thank you for listening, and I'd be interested to hear any of your questions.
Thank you very much, Harry. Professor Daniels there giving us an overview of some of the emergent findings from the Excluded Live project, and I'm sure we'll have a few minutes for some questions and answers after the next speakers. Our next speaker today in person here in London is Angela Jackman, Honorary King's Counsel. She is a partner at Irwin Mitchell. She specialises in mental capacity, education and human rights law. And we may know Angela from her conduct of the landmark Cornrose School Exclusion judicial review case, she and St. Gregory's Catholic Science College. Of course, during that case, the High Court found that the school uniform policy and appearance policy did result in indirect racial discrimination under the Equality Act in 2010. And in 2018, Angela was awarded the Lawyer of the Year by the Modern Law Awards. And I'll invite Angela now to come and speak. Thank you. You can sit here and I can move for you.
Okay. So yes, I'm going to give a practical practitioner delivery based on very personal involvement in the case, and also thinking about, we've had a really excellent overview just now in terms of complex issues, the fact that they've been long-standing problems, the extent of exclusion, and some very serious impacts on the next generation of leaders in the country, I see our young people. And what I wanted to focus on was some of the real challenges facing a community that's already significantly excluded, and therefore, as far as I'm concerned, it's all the more important that their experience of schooling is inclusive, and that they're not subject to the level of discrimination or microaggressions that unfortunately still happen in some schools. So next slide, please. So what I thought I'd look at in my time was, that I've been involved in exclusions for a number of years, and it's already been mentioned that I had the privilege really to represent G in St. Gregory's Catholic Science College judicial review, and I can't believe it, 11 years ago, I can't believe that we still have some of these issues still presenting to our young people. I thought I'd also look at some later cases where young people and their families have had to battle to try and bring about change and to really impress the need for schools to be inclusive. Chikazi and Ruby have been, really brave young people who have been there in the public domain, talking about some of the issues and challenges that they faced, and looking at what some of the arguments are in terms of trying to address some of these ongoing problems. Now, I'm not saying that every single school out there gets it wrong. I had the privilege recently of sitting on a panel at the National Festival of Education with a CEO and head teacher of the school that's been very strident about completely changing the school uniform and including policies because of recognising the discriminatory effects that some policies have. So there's some positive work out there. There's a lot more, I think, to be carried out. And some of those cries are for looking at the statutory guidance, calls to try to amend the Equality Act 2010, and also including on something which has shed, I think, some light and some positivity, something called a HRLA code, which some of you may have heard of. Next slide, please, Avril. So, let's stand here so I can see it a bit better. Yes, so causes and consequences is the theme of today. We've had some detailed analysis of that, and there'll be much more to follow from my co-panelists who are the expert, Professor Gus John and Peter. As I said, my particular concern is looking at the discriminatory manner in which some policies are carried out by schools and how they can really impact on young people. We're looking at causes and consequences. I know from speaking to young people that the way in which policies can be applied can leave them feeling very excluded, loss of self-esteem, a real attack on their identities, and depending on how far the school might want to go, to exclusion. And we already know that the very serious consequences to exclusion have really long-term impact on the pupil's ability to achieve their maximum potential. And in the site, you know, I grew up with my parents telling me, you have to work twice as hard as some of your counterparts to get to where you want to go to. And I'm sure that there are still black parents saying that to their children. And so to lose vital schooling is very, very serious. I mentioned some positive practice. So the head teacher of a school called Townley Grammar School sat on a panel with myself and two of his students, two young women who were very vocal about before and after school. They spoke about how many of their peers were constantly finding themselves pulled aside and told your hair is not appropriate, go and change it, go and cut it, and how that really infringed on them and made them feel, you know, they didn't enjoy their education. And we are told that your school days are some of the most important days of your life, and I think it's very, very wrong that schooling is carried out in such a way that certain communities don't feel that they can engage and enjoy it and focus on their learning. So as a result of discussions with the pupil and the community, this particular head teacher abolished rules on appearance and presentation by recognising that the way in which the policy applied discriminated against, in particular, black students with natural Afro-textured hair. And I still think, on one level, it is ridiculous that in 2022, this is an issue, that we still have students having difficulties, threatened with exclusion because of the state of our natural hair. But that's a fact. And I still think that there's a lot more work that needs to be carried out so that this situation can be resolved. Next slide, please. So let's look at the current guidance, and it's quite topical because the school exclusions guidance over the years it's been reformed and updated so many times. I remember originally the term suspension was used for fixed term and short term exclusion, and that was scrapped and became fixed term, and now it's suspension. And so there's a level of required to keep up to date with the guidance and the thinking behind it. And then, one does question the schools and all the staff also manage to keep up to date. But the key DFE guidance that schools rely upon in terms of procedure and process for excluding was updated. So the new guidance came into effect on the 1st of September this year. It's very recent. What hasn't changed is the emphasis on exclusions and the fact that they ought to be an absolute last resort. And I specifically highlight paragraph 11 of the guidance, which says that certainly the decision to permanently exclude should only be taken in response to a serious breach or persistent breach of the school's behaviour policy, and where allowing the pupil to remain in school seriously harm the educational welfare of the pupil or others, such as staff or pupils in school. And I know that there are many people whose view is that there should be zero tolerance in terms of exclusion. But fact of the matter is, at the moment, schools can exclude. What I'm trying to say is the guidance makes it very clear that it shouldn't be a punishment that's lightly imposed. Next slide, please. And by way of illustration, paragraph 15 of the guidance sets out the types of behaviour which the government takes as of a sufficiently serious nature to justify suspension or permanent exclusion. And I'm not saying I endorse that, but that's what the guidance states. So it's very, very clear that it should be serious forms of behaviour only where suspension or permanent exclusion is considered. Next slide. So my issue is where exclusions take place based on school uniform and appearance policies. And much of the information is anecdotal, because if you imagine it, many parents, if they've tried really hard to get their son or daughter into a school which they consider to be a good school, bearing in mind what the statistics say to us about disproportionate levels of unemployment, about the attainment gap in terms of awarding of degrees to students, that there's at least a 13% gap between black students and white students in terms of the numbers who are given first class degrees and 2-1s. So parents are going to think very, very long and hard about taking on a school, especially if they think it's a good school. And I do think that means that much happens in schools that shouldn't. And I'll talk about that a bit more when I come onto my case G. So uniform policies have had a really serious impact over the last few years, spanning to my case from 2011, where pupils are excluded because of Afro-textured hair, or in the case of G, which I think is probably on the next slide, wearing his hair in cornrows. Next slide, please. So let's talk about G. Avril, you mentioned it when you introduced me, and this was, I had no idea it was going to have the national press interest and the impact, and that I'd still talking about it 11 years on, and that it's be used, for example, on courses in diversity and inclusion. But this was a headline piece in The Guardian the day after the High Court judge, Mr. Justice Collins, handed down judgment. And when we went to court and had judgment handed down, the press was really because they wanted to hear about the issues, because I think some of them wanted to give a perspective that the school had been racist, and some were taking what some might say a slightly inflammatory approach to it all. The judge had been aware of some previous reporting from earlier hearings that he was concerned that the issues were not misrepresented, and he actually called in the press before handing down judgment to say that he'd be very concerned that there was misreporting of what his decision was about, and that the case wasn't about allegations of the school being racist, but it was very specific about policy, and that it was very specific about the individual circumstances and cultural circumstances of G and his family. Next slide. So by way of summary, and I'm conscious of time, G and his mum instructed me a few weeks after the beginning of the new academic year in 2009. He had been to visit the school. They were aware of the uniform appearance policy. Mum actually had it on her person on the first day of term when he went along excited in the new uniform, his hair even more beautifully plaited, which is what you would do as a black mum when you have your child going to a special event. So he turned up to school really excited, looking forward to the first day. He was apprehended in the corridor, and after some confusion on his part and his mum's part, told to call her, the ultimatum was given that he had to go away and cut his hair if he wanted to come back to school, because the appearance policy only basically permitted short back and sides. They spent a long time trying to negotiate. The school said that they were baffled because the policy didn't state that boys were not permitted to wear their hair in cornrows, but yet this is what they're being told first day on arrival, and to open days before. So trying to negotiate when he could take his, this is the level that it descended to, that he could take his hair out of cornrows and having a ponytail. They said, well, the ponytail would be too big. He could have it out in afro, the afro would be too big, would be health and safety. These kind of discussions took place, which were mortifying. It sounds almost comical now to think that that's what a school would focus on when we're talking about a young child's starting his vital secondary education. That's what happened in the case. He didn't cut his hair because, from a cultural perspective, men in his family never cut their hair. It's cultural and related to their racial identity. The school simply wouldn't accept that. So the ultimatum remained even after they had meetings and tried to negotiate. And so it simply, he couldn't contemplate doing that because this was too much in terms of his identity, too much of an infringement, some would say, of his human rights and his identity in terms of his race and culture. So he fortunately found another school in the locality that was inclusive and welcoming, which is a good example, because if that school could have him and he thrived and did very well, why could the original school not do the same thing? They felt so strongly about it that they instructed me to litigate, and so issued a judicial review claim. We pleaded sex discrimination because the school permitted girls to wear their hair in cornrows, and we pleaded indirect race discrimination. When the claim started, it was the Race Relations Act 95, but by the time we finished, the Equality Act 2010 was in force. And as you heard, Mr. Justice Collins ruled that the policy was unlawful because it resulted in indirect racial discrimination, because it didn't allow for any pupil to apply for exemption from the standard policy and to be able to present and give good evidence that it wasn't mere fashion that they wanted to be exempted from the policy, but for reasons related to their cultural identity. Next slide, please. And so what was the outcome? The school revised its policy to enable students to apply to be exempted. And it was the first case in which indirect racial discrimination was based on cultural belief as opposed to religious. And we were successful in persuading the court because of a range of extra evidence that we gathered and presented within the claim. And I think, especially with the press interest, it did shine a light on the need for schools to think about diversity and inclusion. It didn't get rid of all the problems, but I think it can put it on the agenda. Next slide. So you would think that with cases being in the limelight, that schools would take a measured approach and would really think about diversity and inclusion and think about the impact that some adverse policies and decisions can have, but that hasn't been the case. And I do believe that, we've been told that we probably don't actually know the true extent of exclusion by Harry in his first presentation. I would say that we probably don't know the extent of what's going on around the country around some of these issues, because parents and young people feel quite intimidated about challenging those decisions, and because if you feel that your child is at a good school, however you may define that, it may impact on the steps that you take to challenge. So Chikezi had to bring legal challenge, and there was much press about Chikezi. I didn't act with him, but I was aware, very much aware of the case and followed it, because a particular school excluded him because he was wearing his hair in it was a church school, and there's lots of information that went around. There's a huge campaign, And at the beginning of the campaign, it appeared that the school was disputing whether Rastafarianism was a religion. And it seemed to me quite obvious that they were going to have to concede quite soon, and they did. So they conceded, but only as a result of the parents really standing up, having the community behind them, and challenging and just simply not accepting this. But he wasn't permitted to attend the school until that dispute, whilst that dispute was going on. So it was an exclusion, and again at the beginning of a journey, a transition, when you want to have happy memories of starting that school and how that can all feed into how you feel and how you might perform. Next slide. More recently, we've had a very, very proactive young woman, Ruby Williams, who was 17 when she was encountering constant challenges at her school, and that was because she kept on being subjected to being sent home or internal exclusions because of wearing her hair in an afro, and school raising concerns around health and safety, that it was too high, and just simply not allowing her to be who she was and wearing her hair naturally. So again, that was incredibly stressful. Ruby's mom, Kate Williams, was very, very proactive on Twitter. If you might want to look her up, but she's still very much campaigning around her view that there ought to be at least more strident statutory guidance to stop other pupils going through the same kind of traumatic experience that her daughter went through and that the family went through. So they were forced into litigating, issued a counter-court claim, and subsequently was successful. So that was 2020 around the corner. Next slide, please. So consequences of exclusion, as I said, you know, what really concerns me is the loss of educational provision, which is just so important. I'm sitting on the panel recently with the head teacher and two of his students at the Festival of Education, hearing directly from them. They really spoke from the heart about how they and their peers previously felt really under attack because of the draconian way in which policies are applied, and also just picking up and reading between the lines. I think what was particularly concerning was different teachers' individual interpretation of the policy, so not even consistency in terms of how the policy is applied, and just how challenging that is for pupils. And I do think that in the aftermath of George Floyd, again, we've had mentioned earlier to the Black Lives Matter movement, which, as we know, didn't start with George Floyd, but great emphasis as a result of the murder of George Floyd. And I think very rightly we have a generation of young people coming through who have a very strong sense of justice and injustice. And I think that's very important. And I think that as carers or influencers in their lives or as a legal profession, we should be helping them to achieve those goals. Next slide. And so again, to place this in context, and the fact that this isn't me having going off as a limb and kind of not really aware of what the ongoing issues are. As recently as March 2022, article in The Guardian, a few teachers are aware that equalities legislation applies to their school's policies on hair, despite high-profile cases affecting Black students. And more than 3/4 of teachers have not received any training on how the 2010 Act applies to school uniform appearance policy. So that was just a few months ago. Next slide. To round up, solutions. What's going to be effective? More statutory guidance. Some may say that's not going to go far enough. We need to have particular targeted guidance around uniform appearance policy. Looking at the new guidance issued a few weeks ago, I saw with interest this paragraph 106 places a requirement on governing bodies to consider the level of pupil moods and characteristics of pupils. And then it goes on to say that they are meant to look at their data on exclusions and manage moves and so on, and to kind of analyse and to understand if they show that policy is not working. And for me, understanding the characteristics of excluded pupils and what is happening is really key, because I would hope that the proper training and proper commitment to diversity and inclusion in school, that this will be a pointer to governing bodies to really look at racial issues and diversity and inclusion issues, and how the impact of their exclusion practice feeding into that. So next slide, I promise I've nearly finished. Does current guidance go far enough? I would say that we need more. We certainly need more training, especially being told just a few months ago a very small percentage of teachers who are even aware that equalities legislation apply. And there is a bigger kind of campaigning call to amend the Equality Act to include Afro-textured hair as a protected characteristic. I think that would be wonderful, but whether it's going to happen, who knows? But it's certainly out there as a campaigning piece. And I think finally, positive steps to think about, because we can become very depressed thinking about the state of affairs of exclusion and the impact on our young people. I think that schools that have put their heads above the parapet and who actively want to make change are partly doing so because they're listening to their student population, they're involving the community. And I think the Townley Grammar School that completely scrapped uniform appearance policy. And there's wonderful pictures if you look it up of the head teacher standing next to pupils who've got hair, all sorts of different colours, because as far as the school is concerned, appearance doesn't matter. You're there to learn and to achieve your potential. And there have been some positive initiatives. The HALO Code, some of you may be aware of this, a collective called the HALO Collective, put together basically a statement of intent, and some schools have adopted it, and also some employers. My firm adopted it, and it's basically a statement to make very clear to your students or your employees that they are welcome to come to work, their authentic self. That's a terminology that we hear quite a lot of, that they are welcome to attend work or school wearing their hair naturally, and that there's no prospects of them running into any difficulties or encountering adverse treatment as a result of wearing their hair naturally. So it means that students don't have to worry about that in the workplace. You don't have to worry that you can only succeed if you choose or feel that you have no choice, but to wear processed hair or to wear a wig or whatever. It's about choice, absolutely about choice. And I think that something like the HALO Code is an example that things can be done. That's me finished. Sorry if I'm over a bit. Thank you for listening.
Now we've got our own halo after Angela's wonderful presentation, where we got an insight into changes that have come about through the courts, and some food for thought as to what kind of change may be necessary on the legislative level. Now our next speaker is Mr. Peter Babudu. He was a former Southwark councillor. He led the charge for school exclusions to be scrapped in the borough of Southwark. He's a community activist, and he is going to tell us how he went about that wonderful action against Southwark. Welcome everybody, it's Peter Babudu.
Thanks so much. Let me check this out. Really good speaking to everyone. Sorry you can't see my slides, but it will encourage me to be brief, I'm sure. So yeah, I'm Peter Babudu. Until recently, I was a councillor in Southwark, where I chaired the Education Scrutiny Commission. I also, more generally, I work for a national youth violence charity called the Youth Endowment Fund, and our work does span looking at the kind of effects of exclusions and what can be done to reduce the likelihood of them. And my kind of last hat on the moment as chair of the Blago Trust, it's a trust focused very much on looking at how you can support and in other ways get out of the way of young people and help them to address challenges that are affecting their lives. And I think Exclusions really kind of speaks to that. Speaks to that space of things that kind of profoundly affect young people and often done with very limited involvement of them. So without getting anyone to kind of confess anything they don't want to, does anyone here have family members that have been excluded? Yeah. Okay, so we've got a few hands. Sorry, people online, I can't see you. And has anyone been excluded themselves in the room?
Not anything.
Okay, all right. Oh yeah, I probably should have raised my hand for both. I was excluded at 5 years old, and I have to rely on my mother's kind of take of how and why it happened to kind of work through it. But I think it probably speaks to some of what Professor Johnny, you're going to speak about. My mother and father were brought in, kind of told about how difficult it was to educate me, how much I wasn't progressing, which is quite bullish for a 5-year-old. But they also hadn't caught fundamental things like the fact I could read. And I think that experience probably just speaks to the extent of prejudice that underpinned so many exclusions of that time. And by the time I'd looked at exclusions nearer to the current day, I was convinced that lots of that was still carrying on, maybe slightly more subtle at times, but definitely still exists. So I want to talk about the experience of the review that was done in Southwark. I want to talk about how we got to the point where across the borough, all schools, including academies, commit to signing up to an inclusion charter, and some of the other things that I hope will come on next from beyond that point. So I'll slashing off sways of my presentation, but I think we really have a firm sense of what an exclusion is and why it matters so much, and the hidden numbers that sit behind it. But I will say that behind every on-record exclusion, just the way that elective home education tracks through, the amount of kind of managed moves, and the amount of exclusion that doesn't quite fit the bar or frame, so isn't being reported properly, it's a much wider problem than people recognise. When I took over education scrutiny in Southwark, in the 4 years prior, the rates of exclusion had doubled. And this had happened not just in Southwark; it happened across London as well. And it's a bit less than doubling nationally, but in London, you were seeing a significant uptick in the amount of exclusions. That was similarly the case in the rates of elective home education as well. And it just spoke to the fact that there seemed something quite strange in the way that exclusions were tracking along and rising in the same way as elective home education. So I launched a review and had a really tough journey of getting to the data of what is happening, who's being excluded, and over the course of the work, identified that as a council, because the significant majority, nearly all secondary schools in Southwark are academies, the local authority found itself pretty powerless and often wanting to do things to maintain decent relationships with schools, so not pushing, not challenging when they weren't getting the data reported back that they should do. So we spent our first few months trying to get at what really is happening here, where exclusion is being driven. We found that 2 academy chains were driving a significant proportion of exclusions across the borough, the rate they were excluded at was markedly higher, at points to kind of double other schools. Just the human stories we heard from young people, on their experiences of exclusion. We had, I was really insistent that we would have young people taking part in my scrutiny commission, that we would make sure that, yeah, great, we had like teachers, education experts, but made sure that young people's voice was there. And we had people who spoke about being excluded for opening the door too loudly, for eating a biscuit in class, as well as like kind of penalising for the standard set of things you'll see, be it untucked shirts and otherwise. And it really spoke to a problem. And we heard from parents who just didn't feel that they had the kind of power to engage effectively with the schools. And we had examples of people who like de facto excluded, which just, I think, kind of blew my mind a bit when you had like students in South who wasn't allowed in school with a hijab, didn't feel equipped to kind of take that on and kind of take on the school, as your presentation kind of spoke to the many reasons behind that. We brought in the Regional Schools Commissioner, who is kind of responsible for effectively the representative of the Secretary of State Education across, I think, 22 local authorities, including Southwark. And I think at some point it kind of hit me that lots of the problems we were seeing was not the system malfunctioning. It was the system functioning as it was intended to, and that was what seems so kind of problematic around it. So I think what proved a bit of a breakthrough for the Commission was the power of young people's testimonies, recognizing that for lots of the schools doing exclusions, yes, they were themselves often in like kind of challenging contexts, resource constrained, trying to kind of deliver results that would get them kind of performing well in league tables. But at some point, with kind of young people's voice at the heart of things, we did hit a point where, in particular, one of the academy chains was just open to saying like, yeah, we're not doing everything the way that we should here. We do accept that we're kind of excluding more than we otherwise might. And part of the point they opened up was, well, we want to be able to work with a local authority in a bit of a different way. We want them to look at how they use the budget for alternative provision. So for those who do get excluded and might end up in a people referral unit, how schools and the local authority can collaborate that bit more. And I think that kind of little bite was in part opened up by the voices of young people. And young people who spoke to our commission, they said explicitly one of the things they want is an inclusion charter, a public commitment from schools across the borough and the local authority to work better together, often aligning in some ways with guidance that formally exists but isn't being that well held to, but talked about the ways that they try and avoid encouraging people to home educate in contexts that weren't in the best interest of the child. Fast forward 2 long years, we reached the point of the inclusion charter being kind of all but agreed and kind of going through the formal processes of council approval, and schools across the borough, including the 2 academy chains that were driving such a large proportion of exclusion in Southwark, agreed to sign up to the charter. And I think I definitely got a lesson in how contentious this as an issue can be, because the BBC did a story on Southwark banning exclusions, which wasn't what we were doing. We were working with schools to find ways to stop children being excluded, and more than that, find ways for them to be included, which goes so much further than saying just stopping exclusions. And immediately there were kind of Twitter pile-ins of like, I bet these aren't teachers, what are they doing? They're going to make our schools dangerous. There were councillors in Southwark that they were written to and asked, could you do everything in your power to stop this charter? And it's such a kind of politicized issue. And what we're looking at is like children who were already vulnerable, being made more vulnerable. It's unclear to me how often so many of the changes are making anyone safer. You've got children that are often left more open to exploitation. And so I think just the kind of the toxic nature of the debate, I do hope we get to a point where we can move beyond it and recognise that it's in everyone's best interest for children to be well supported by their schools, for there to be enough flexibility to find ways to actually kind of let them succeed and to thrive. So just in terms of other recommendations that came through our commission, we thought it was really important that that Southwark, and I think this probably has much wider, try to like kind of dig into the data it was getting to better understand the kind of racial disproportionality playing through exclusions. And we've heard a bit about it, but there was a clear trend of Black Caribbean children in particular being disproportionately excluded, Gypsy Roman traveller children being disproportionately excluded as well. And trying to get to a place where schools really are seeing it as part of their responsibility to ask questions about like, why is that happening? Like, even if we've been excluded in accordance with our policies and so on, it just seems fundamentally problematic if your policies entail that it's mainly Black children and Gypsy Roman traveller children that they're excluded. And I won't go into all the other recommendations, but we also were really struck by the fact that kind of the way that home education is often coming about is putting parents who are in a particularly difficult position to support their children, right? Having to meet all the more complex demands, and how can a local authority better support that? Since my commission conducted its review, exclusions across the borough have fallen markedly, but COVID played a huge role. I think COVID suppressed a large amount, and we went from having, I think it was in the 70s in 2017-18, 51 in the next year, through to 2020-21, we have 13 exclusions in the borough, and the 21-22, we're looking at 10 exclusions. So there's a kind of trajectory happening there, and I think there has been a bit of a modal shift in terms of how schools engage in the borough. And now that we're at the point of actually implementing that inclusion charter, I hope we get to a place where it is genuinely exceptional that children are excluded, and you cease to see the kind of movement with more home education, with more managed moves happening at the same time. And I have a bit more to cover, but I'm eager to leave enough space for questions and other presentations. I guess the only thing I'll say in closing is I was really struck by the extent to which parents, carers and guardians often feel unsupported through this process, find it hard to navigate things. And I think the way, there's such a critical role that I know that some people in this room are involved in it, the role that organisations can play in helping those who to navigate the process and understand it a bit better. In the course of my review, I had some parents approaching me in Southwark talking about what had happened in their cases, and it was really striking that when you could, even in like semi-official channels, just raise a question like, this parent says that they were told it was better to take their child out rather than to have them go through the full exclusion process. Is that what you're doing at your school? And we had children getting back in school. And since we conducted this, we've been working with Southwark Law Centre and others to look at how can we better support parents and carers to ask challenging questions, because often that is all that's needed in some cases to roll back exclusions. And I think there does need to be both a kind of shift in how we all think about how we can include students, but also some robust challenging of the like kind of persistent practices to exclude far too many children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I was very struck by your comment that there was a realization that the exclusions were happening not because there was a breakdown in the system, but that it was functioning as it had been designed. And very interesting to hear how you've gone about in reducing those number of school exclusions. Our next and final speaker is Professor Gus John. He is the co-founder of the Communities Empowerment Network. He is an honorary professor, and he will talk to us about school exclusions and looking at the disproportionate number of Black students who are implicated in and impacted by school exclusions and what he calls the war on youth in both school and communities here in the UK. Professor Jackman.
Greetings all. First of all, apologies for turning up late. I was involved in some freak accident on the way here, which has left me bruised and sore. Someone knocked me down an escalator, and that was not funny. Yes, I want to thank Harry for his presentation and both colleagues here. You've said, especially in the presentation that Harry did, many of the things I was going to preface my remarks with. I'm going to turn away from all of that. You've heard the presentation on St. Gregory's Catholic School. I had some involvement in that I was asked to be an expert witness until the school challenged that and talked all kinds of other nonsense. I'm glad Angela acquainted us with what the issues were and what the outcome was. In one sense, I think in the time that we have left, I just want to paint a broader picture of what all of this is about and where it's coming from. When in 1999, we, Jerry German, the late Jerry German, who used to be the principal education officer at the CRE, myself, John O'Malley, also late on account of COVID, and Jimmy Adifarani, who was a counselor in Lewisham Council, got together and started the Communities Empowerment Network. We did so because we were alarmed, and Jerry in particular, given the number of complaints that were coming through to the Commission for Racial Equality about exclusions. We were alarmed at the number of children, and especially the disproportionate number of Black children who were being excluded. And the fact that the government seemed pretty sanguine about the whole thing. And we call it Communities Empowerment Network because we didn't just want to be firefighters, dealing with one individual case of exclusion after another, and this treadmill, because the one thing that was clear was that the schools would be producing these exclusion cases much faster than we could do anything about them. And that turned out to be the case. But what we hoped was that by working with individual parents, getting a broader picture of what was happening in any one local authority area, we'd be able to get parents to be much better equipped by information that we were going to produce to them, by knowledge, by example, better equipped to hold schools to account. And we also hope that we'd have an influence upon LEAs, local education authorities, in terms of the way they manage their own schools and what have you. At that point, we had a whole lot of grant-maintained schools, which were the precursors, if you like, of academies, and not so many academies then. Our wish to build a movement of empowered parents wasn't quite realized, because what tended to happen, and I think to a large extent, the kind of Thatcherist construction of individualism and all of that stuff led parents to believe that if I could simply make sure that my child is all right, then it doesn't really matter what's happening to others. And for me, as an activist who's been on the education scene, or doing education activism since the middle 1960s, when I was a student of theology at Oxford, it was most discouraging to find that parents were not prepared to mobilize themselves, have a belief in the potential of collective action to bring about change, and was simply focusing on their individual child and their problem with school and doing something about that. Now, in 1975, I and a number of other people formed in North London the Black Parents Movement. And we did so again because of what was going on in schools. We had been involved many years earlier, late 1960s, in forming the North London West Indian Association that dealt with issues of banding and streaming, etc., in Haringey Council. We formed the Black Parents Movement, and we had a massive conference at a place called the Keskitty Center off Caledonian Road in King's Cross. And at that conference, we basically drew up a kind of manifesto. We argued that teachers are unionized, head teachers have got their teaching unions, but the people without whom there won't be schools, students and their parents, had no collective forum in which to bring their issues. So we adumbrated the principles that independent students' power and independent parents' power were the key to change in education and schooling. Speaking personally, as someone who was engaging in schools in Oxford in 1965 and 66, I find it extraordinary that although we've had this situation where Black young people in particular have been always bumping along the bottom in terms of its schooling results and speaking volubly about the quality of their education outcomes and educational experience, schooling experience, we have not managed to have a national students organization, a national Black school students organization, or for that matter, a national parents organization. Because I do believe that if you don't have that kind of mobilization to hold not just individual schools, but governments to account, then all that sort of thing that Harry and Angela Peter were talking about would be heaped upon you. And that is what is actually happening. So the government has enabled parents to form the view that it is my child that matters. That whole sort of neoliberal notion of I for myself and the market will take care of the rest. And therefore, it doesn't matter what's going on in a particular school. It's seen as a matter between that school and the individual student, as distinct from that school and the body of parents in that area to whom they should be accountable. And of all the things that were mentioned in terms of what needs to be done, I am personally committed to making sure that we have such an organized body of students and parents in the place. Because you see, it seems to me, education is a right, it's an entitlement, it's a human right. The government provides education. But there is a contract, in my view, between the government and society as far as the provision of education is concerned. And what we don't interrogate sufficiently is the nature of that contract. Because whatever else any head teacher or anybody might think, the fact of the matter is that all parents are required to send their children to school. So children come to school as they are, and they bring what they are. Some are highly motivated and organized, others not so. Some have got complex needs, others not so. So if schooling is for everybody, then schools have got to be organized in a manner that could deal with all children's needs, however complex. But what has happened, particularly in the last 20 years or so, is that more and more the government has brought together, or rather instituted, a two-tier system of education. So there are those who conform. You don't come to school with your hair in braids. You don't do this, you don't do that, the other, and you are good. We are happy with you. And then the others get shunted into alternative provision, pupil referral units, other forms of alternative provision. And that paper, which Avril has kindly circulated, has got those arguments much more coherently presented. So I commend it to you. I want to make 2 points. One is that what Harry was describing, and Angela, is just how, not just brutal, but ridiculous that whole focus on punishment is within schools. In CEN, I don't have the time to do much casework, but I have worked as an advocate, particularly outside of London. And I just find it extraordinary how uncompassionate school management could be in all sorts of situations. So we know that there is an economic downturn. We know there has been COVID. We know there are all kinds of pressures on parents and students. And yet, during COVID, in one particular case, this single parent lost both her parents. She had to leave work to take care of her father until he passed on. And the 15-year-old goes to school and is supposed to wear black leather shoes as part of the uniform policy. The woman had unmanageable funeral expenses. She'd given up a job. She was living and feeding her children from food banks. So this boy goes to school wearing black trainers. He's sent home first day. And then he's sent home every single day for a whole week, and then given a fixed term exclusion for 3 days. And when I said to the mother, well, did you inform the school? She says, of course, the school knew that both his grandparents had died. But he didn't tell them that he wasn't able to afford leather shoes because he feared that they would children would start bullying him and all sorts of stuff. But he had no need to explain to people why he was coming in trainers rather than leisure shoes, because the school knew that he just lost to parents. And the last time I inquired, I learned that we learn using some matter up here, not what on our feet or under our feet. And so this nonsense about hair and the length of there was one particular school I had some problems with, again, another Catholic high school, where the head teacher insisted that all boys, all black boys, should come with a hair not less than number 1 on the barber's wreath or whatever that is. I should know because I don't have a lot myself. And when I challenged them, they said, we have that policy because young white boys from our particular area look like skinheads when their heads are below a certain, hairs are below a certain length. And if we have that rule for white boys, we can't have a separate rule for black boys. So I said to this head teacher, when else have you seen a skinhead? He couldn't answer. But as far as he was concerned, that length of hair was associated with bother boys and racists. And it's that kind of ridiculous nonsense that make parents bewildered as to what is actually happening to the children in schools. There is no way on earth that any head teacher could assume that those children coming to school would come pristine as they would like. Different children have different needs. They come from different circumstances. And that child queue situation, which I think we all know about, is a particular case in point. People talk about adultification, which is a complete nonsense, as far as I'm concerned. A 15-year-old menstruating is precisely that. You can't expect, it's not as if she was 7. And then the whole idea of schools handing over their authority to police, which is what happened in that situation. Even if that young girl had cannabis on her, that would, in my book, be a safeguarding issue. A safeguarding issue in relation to the child and her well-being, not something that you call the police in so that they could criminalize her. So my main point is this. There is this highly brutal, punitive approach to children and their infractions, which defines the school regime in many instances. That needs to be contested. You will see in this paper that after the 2011 uprisings in Tottenham, as a result of the killing by the police of Mark Duggan, David Cameron talked about the next part of the social fight back is what happens in schools. We need an education system which reinforces the message that if you do the wrong thing, you will be disciplined. And then Michael Gove went further, saying that the absence of discipline contributed greatly to the causes of the riots. And his department would ensure that tougher disciplinary measures would be introduced into schools as, to quote him, the balance had shifted too far in favor of young people who say, I know my rights. So he's effectively disavowing the practice and the need to have knowledge about your rights. My final point is that it's about time that we all challenged the government and every Secretary of State for Education to operate a schooling system in this country within the terms, spirit, and letter of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Because those articles in that convention are being flagrantly ignored every step of the way, especially in relation to making sure that the interests of the child are paramount in whatever decisions we take. It is a very serious business. I believe that everything Harry has said, everything everybody has said, is evidence that the system is broken and badly in need of repair. But that repair will only come, in my view, if it isn't just left to you good people as excellent advocates to go to judicial review or to some court or something, but when parents themselves collectively stand up and say to government, you will not continue to do that to our children because you're brutalizing them and you're encouraging them in terms of how they themselves might operate and brutalize others.
Thank you very much, Professor John. We really appreciate you coming, and very sorry to hear about your journey here. That brings us to the end of the presentations for this evening. We have a couple of questions that have been put on the Q&A online, and I'm going to go to the first of those. We are running a little over, but we'll certainly answer those two questions. The first one, Professor Daniels has said he'd like to answer, and it's from Shauna Kane. The question is internal exclusion, isolation or seclusion, is that included as part of the review which you've been undertaking?
We're certainly looking at both those things. I wouldn't call it what we're doing a review. We're looking at particular schools in particular authorities, schools which are excluding more than one would expect because of their particular local circumstances, schools which are excluding fewer than one would expect, and so on. Very carefully sampled structure, but we're looking at those issues in those circumstances, yes.
Thank you. And the second question there is from Claire Jackson, and her question is, how do we get the message of just how damaging exclusions and the practice of informal, unlawful exclusions are through to the government to inform legislative change when they have the ear of certain behaviour experts who advocate zero tolerance and heavy-hand approaches? Would anyone like to take that question?
May I?
Yes.
Our finding is that quite a lot of people in government agencies do know about all of that. What they're having difficulty with is persuading elected members to act. So the civil service does contain people who understand all this, who understand the poverty of alternative provision and so on and so on. But they have difficulty in persuading their political masters to do anything, on particular governors, to do anything about it.
Let me add to that. I think it's very little known that about 20% of all schools in the country do not exclude. And they manage not to exclude anybody. They don't have any declared zero exclusion policy, but they manage not to exclude because they know that it is not in the best interest of children to exclude them. So the wraparound children behavior education support services, which they're able to signpost children and parents to, while giving them the support that they need to overcome whatever difficulties they may have. So they structure the school day separately, many of them, and they have a totally different relationship with, in terms of the definition of the partnership between school and home. And what I think needs to happen is that those folk need to write more about themselves and their practice. They need to encourage more people to look at what they're doing and evaluate it. And also to demonstrate that if you take a non-punitive approach, you don't hand out behavior points like confetti around the place. And you work with students and their parents, even those students who have got complex needs or who are very bad at behavior. Respond in a manner that suggests that they are aware that somebody cares. Somebody's investing in them and their development. And they are much more able, therefore, to do their part in making the school, the learning environment, one in which children could learn and feel safe, and teachers could teach and feel safe.
Peter, is there anything you'd like to add to that question?
Yeah, I do think it kind of touches the politics quite importantly. Just that I think that a space has been opened by dehumanizing children. It may sound a bit dramatic, but if you want to just normalize harsh punishments and make it kind of generally acceptable to the public. I think it requires this kind of narrative of like, oh, there are bad kids that we need to control to have taken hold. And I think that there's an important piece, as well as gathering hard evidence about what exclusions do, of like to show the kind of human stories that sit behind these exclusions, kind of challenging some of that public narrative, because that's part of how you make some of the political space for a shift to be done on that front. Because I do agree. I think amongst like civil servants and kind of far beyond, there is, and even one of the people who didn't join the Twitter pylon, but on the other side, was a Conservative MP. I don't think it fits neatly across party lines, but there's lots of examples of people making out that I actually danger of kids. If you don't do this, your child could be next. You know, you just need to hold that back in. So I think challenging that narrative will be a key part of actually getting policies to ultimately change.
But I think also schools genuinely arguing that particular forms of behaviour are particularly severe, then there are procedures that they are supposed to use. The issue partly around informal exclusions, where it's all underground and contributes to a lack of full understanding of what the full extent of exclusion is because of the informal unlawful practices. I do remember that some years ago there was a BBC journalist ringing around education lawyers, specifically wanting to know if there were any clients who had experienced informal exclusion. So I know sometimes it's been in the public domain, and I just think that perhaps with the right kind of movement of organisations like CEM and parents, it needs to come back on the agenda. And the exclusions guidance does specifically refer to, it always has done, that informal exclusions are unlawful. And the new guidance emphasises that, and also for the first time has quite a detailed section on off-site provision. So to me, it's kind of really there that there is off-site provision, but there's meant to be safeguards before schools use that. And I would hope that could feed into acknowledgement that where exclusions happen, they should comply with the letter of the exclusion guidance and the legislation, and not the underhand.
So the full extent is known.
Yeah.
Let me just very quickly add something to this. The government is speaking from both sides of its mouth in this respect. We will remember, most of us, that prior to 2015, there was the avenue open to parents to challenge via independent appeals panels. In 2011, where there is after this Tottenham thing, the government started to look at that again, and indeed, many head teachers at their Easter conferences challenged the government to be more punitive and more harsh, because they were concerned that without that they would lose the whole battle against poor behavior, etc. So the government introduced the independent review panels. And while the IAPs were able to instruct a head teacher to take back a student, and we in CEN worked with heads on reintegration plans and supported them and the parent and the child after we got the child back into school. There is now no opportunity to do that because the independent review panels can't tell a teacher anything. I mean, they might talk about the illegal nature of the exclusion, but they can't get the school to take the child back. And in that situation, either the local authority takes up the challenge or the responsibility to get the child a new school, or the parents have to scout around and find the school. So it's a situation where not only the child is being punished, but effectively the parents too are being punished.
One question here from the audience. Yeah.
It's less of a question and more of an additional perspective. I'm a head teacher at a secondary school. My friend here, Sarah, and I, we've gone out of our way to make sure that as head teachers, we represent our community. So we do totally understand and reflect all the comments that have been made today, because we do practice it, actually. But I think for me, I want to just emphasize a couple of things. The main thing really is about the balance that I think Henry had said earlier. So we do need a balance, because I happen to be in a secondary school that I've taken over, and every comment that I experienced from the teachers who were coming out of COVID was that, please help us with behaviour, because they were struggling, they felt it was chaotic. And so, you know, I'm guilty of bringing in rules and regulations to make sure that students are following expectations. But after a year of that, I could see that actually that takes you to a certain level. And then after that, you have to look at what the root cause of the problem is. And I happen to serve a school that is quite deprived in number. And what we picked up on is that through the COVID pandemic, the students were quite adversely affected, very disengaged with learning. And I think for me, when you can see that, I think COVID really threw a completely different perspective on education, learning, and perspectives of how students engage with school and how parents engage with school. And I think from my perspective, what I've been trying to emphasize now is a lot more about mental health and support and inclusive activities. But what I'm noticing now is that there is a deficit in teacher understanding, teacher training, teacher knowledge about that. And so you then encounter a slightly different element of you want to do the right thing, but actually support systems and structures aren't quite readily there. And on top of that, we work with parents who struggle with their own child's behaviour. So when we're saying work with us, they don't know how to because they struggle themselves. So I think what I want to offer or suggest is when we're looking and reviewing and lobbying for change, that we have that holistic approach, that it is about making sure that schools can function, but it's also making sure that we have the right knowledge and training to support students who will struggle, because we have to be inclusive. We can't, and I totally accept what Professor John was saying regarding some practices of schools who, and I think it was Peter that almost had a kind of policy of if you can't behave, out you go. And I do understand that practice. I'm not saying it's right, but I understand it because you're trying to create an environment where you're emphasising learning, but it's a certain type of learning. And if you're not supporting students to understand how best to engage with learning, which is what another element that I'm trying to introduce this year, that's studying and how do we emphasise for our most disadvantaged students what naturally comes to other students in other environments, how to study, how to engage with learning, how to not give up when you're struggling and not roam the corridors because it's too hard. In order to do that, you've got to be able to look at the whole picture and support parents as best they can to support their child and support the school as well, and we all work together. I know I'm talking from a very idealistic point of view, but I do see and feel it's achievable, but we just need the structures and systems to support it.
Thank you very much for that question, comment, observation. So we've come to the end of the evening. Thank you very much to our 4 speakers and to our attendees and to those of you at home. Thanks for sticking with us. We have run over time quite a bit. The evening has given us a lot of food for thought, I would say, and I could imagine it's just really the start of the conversation. Thank you very much to everyone at home, everyone here, and we may have some refreshments here now afterwards. Thank you.